Hello, everyone, and welcome to session IC68, Supporting the Client, Extending the Impact of the ATP with Client and Caregiver Training. This is in RESNA track within the ISS today. My name is Vince, and I'll be moderating today's session, and will provide the CEU code at the end in the chat, as well as voicing it out at the end as well, so you guys will have both of those. Before we get started, please remember to mute yourself. Questions can be asked using the chat feature and will be addressed throughout the session. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dan Cochrane, Brenda Sposato, and Emma Smith. Thank you.
All right, hello everybody. This is our session on supporting the client, extending the impact of the ATP through client and caregiver training. And this is a RESNA track session focusing on practical ways ATPs and clinicians can support AT implementation. My name is Dan Cochrane, and I am a special educator. I worked in a public school district in the Chicago suburbs for 25 years, the last 13 as the district-wide AT coordinator. I left that a couple of years ago, and now I'm full-time clinical instructor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I teach in the Assistive Technology Certificate Program. As a member of RESNA, I've been part of leadership in RESNA for some years. I'm currently on the board of directors. And I was on the professional standards board that governs the ATP, SMS, and RET from 2011 to 2014, the last 3 years as chair. In terms of conflicts of interest, I have nothing to declare.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brenda Sposato, and I have a biomedical engineering background by trade. I've been with the University of Illinois, Chicago for 30 years, primarily practicing in the area of seating and wheel mobility. The last 10 years, I've also added on the opportunity to practice in the area of home modification. So that's been a nice complement to the seating world. I am a clinical assistant professor. I've been teaching at UIC for the better part of the last 23 years. And I do teach in the Assistive Technology Certificate Program along with Dan. My RESNA involvement is listed there. I've been on different committees over the years and part of the exam writing committee. And I also have no conflicts of interest to declare. I'll turn it to Emma.
Thanks, Brenda. My name is Emma Smith. I am an occupational therapist by training and spent my first 8 years across multiple practice settings, everything from pediatrics to geriatrics and physical to mental health. I'm also a researcher. I did my PhD at the University of British Columbia in rehabilitation sciences in older adult powered wheelchair skills training. And I now work at Maynooth University as a research fellow looking at global health policy in the area of assistive technology. Like Dan and Brenda, I've spent lots of time in leadership at RESNA, and this is one of the RESNA sessions, so I guess this shouldn't be too surprising. I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the Assistive Technology Journal. I sat on the professional standards board as the vice chair with Dan when he was the chair, and have been engaged in things like conference committee and student design, developer showcase. And I also have no conflicts of interest to declare.
All right, thank you guys. So I'd like to set the stage. Many ATPs have experienced the situation where the implementation of an assistive technology solution seemingly went well, only to find out several months or years later that the AT was no longer being used or was used in a limited way. I'm actually using the word underutilization here on the slide against the darkened image of an empty wheelchair. To avoid using the word abandonment, let's assume that the assessment process was done well and that the technology was a good match, but why is it underutilized? So in hindsight, maybe you think about the implementation training that you provided as being focused on the operational skills that your client needed to use their AT. And that's what they were interested in too, right, at the beginning. But it didn't include enough resources to keep them going in their everyday worlds. Not only that, you rightly focused your training on the AT user, but then forgot about the network of support, the relationships and support that with enough training are a significant facilitator for the person's environment. Finally, maybe you realize your training needs to be tailored to the context, the environment in which the user and their network of supports will use the technology. So that's the stage that we are setting here. In order to get to what we want to, these are the objectives that we have set out for ourselves, describing 3 ways that the client and caregiver context impacts the long-term implementation of AT. And then get practical with some resources that the clinician or professional can provide to clients and caregivers to address some common challenges of those contexts. And then describe at least 2 ways to build the capacity of the client or caregiver within specific contexts. So because this is a RESNA track at ISS, I'd like to connect our objectives that I just shared with you to the AT process that is represented by the RESNA ATP exam outline, which you can access on RESNA's website. We're focusing on AT implementation today and elaborating on a few specific tasks that are part of the implementation process. Just a side note, this process, this exam outline is generated by subject matter experts like yourselves, who came together to decide what is AT process all about. So in the implementation section, I want to pull out a few of the items. Number 5 in the outline says, quote, train the client and team members in the device operation, adjustment, care, maintenance, and troubleshooting process across all impacted environments in which the client interacts. And I'm emphasizing the words all team members, right? So to link to caregivers, and all impacted environments, to link to the idea of context. Item number 8 in the outline says, provide or make recommendations regarding ongoing training or services to achieve goals. And then number 9 says to educate the client and the team members, again, emphasizing team members, about changes which may necessitate follow-up to make adjustments or modifications. So those are the quotes from the exam outline. And again, that represents an expert subject matter view of what the AT process is, and it's readjusted over time as we go on. So we're connecting here to what others have said about what's important in terms of the steps of AT implementation, but we're hopefully also going a little bit beyond this by using the term capacity building. So what I'd like to challenge us to think about is, what if we looked at AT implementation as a capacity building project? We might come up with 2 questions from that. What capacities should we build? And how do we build capacity in specific contexts? So to answer the first question, what capacities should we build? In my work, I often refer to a framework of AT competencies or skills, which are adapted from Janice Light's and Kathy Binger's work in augmentative and alternative communication. So I actually mentioned the first one already a few slides back, and that's operational skills. And we know this one, right? It focuses on the buttons and the levers, how to make it work, how to use the technology. And this is where we logically focus our training at first, but we all know it's not enough. The second skill, functional skills, is really, and originally this was linguistic skills in the AAC world. This one focuses on how to use the technology to do something. And this is where the technology then becomes incorporated into the activity or task itself. With wheelchairs, it's the navigation of the real world and all the obstacles that you encounter. With AAC, it's using the device to communicate in social settings. With speech recognition, which is a software that I did a lot of training with students, it's about incorporating that software into the actual writing process, which has a lot of steps, right? So to me, functional skills are about layering the technology into the activity that's meant to support. Most of us probably incorporate this competency into our training, but it's the part that takes time and practice on the part of the user. So it is easy to shortchange in terms of capacity building. So 2 more. The third one, strategic skills, adds another layer. It's a little more advanced in that sense. This focuses on when to use technology and when not to use it. So when you might choose a different tool or do something a different way. The strategic skill involves situational decisions and knowing your options. What are some different options you can use in different situations? And then finally, social skills. Originally, this really connected to linguistic social skills, but it makes sense for all of AT. And it's probably the most advanced competency, although it does come into play right away often. So the focus here is on using the technology in the social setting with others in a social context. And here we might have the need to confront stigma, which then creates the need to self-advocate for the use of AT. So how do we build those capacities in specific contexts? It would be impossible for us to address all contexts in this short workshop. So we selected 3 that match our years of experience. Emma is going to talk about the context of adults living independently in their own homes. Brenda is going to talk about the context of adults living interdependently in community integrated living facilities. And I'm going to talk about kids and young adults at home, at school. I'll call this developmental living, even though, of course, we're all developing, even as adults. So before I turn this over to Emma, I just want to give you a heads up on how we hope to bring a transdisciplinary perspective into this workshop, which is a very RESNA thing. RESNA is a transdisciplinary professional organization, and it's what I love about it. After each of us talk about the common challenges, the capacity building strategies and resources that are specific to each context that we are talking about, the 3 of us are going to have a brief, spontaneous conversation with each other that draws out the way these contexts overlap and inform the others. You may want to chime in the chat, just the chat during that part, but hopefully we are saving time for questions and comments at the end. So our little spontaneous crosstalk sessions are going to be pretty short. They're really a way for us to weave some of this content together for you. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Emma.
Thanks so much, Dan. So as Dan mentioned, I'm going to talk about adults living with minimal support or living independently in the community who may have some support, but probably don't have that continuous level of support that they might have somewhere else, or what we would term in this case is independent living. So when we think about independent living, we're really thinking about the day-to-day skills that somebody needs, not just to operate, as Dan talked about, those operational skills or those functional skills, but some of the more complicated things that may come up, some of the bigger challenges that may need to be addressed. Obviously, those operational and functional skills are really important, but where I really like to focus is on issues around what happens when something goes wrong. We are assuming that if somebody is living independently, they have all the capabilities needing to for that day-to-day stuff, for the typical stuff that happens as they go through their day. But what I like to focus on and think about is those things that could be the troubleshooting needs. So things like if they're a wheelchair user and they have a wheelchair breakdown, what do they do? So Dan, I'm just going to get you to run that video just for a second, just as an example. So here you've got a wheelchair user who's out in the community and they get stuck in soft grass, probably after rain. And so this is the kind of situation which, if the wheelchair user doesn't know how to manage, that could be a real problem. So things like wheelchair breakdowns or getting stuck somewhere. As an example of that, I spent a number of years living in Vancouver in Canada, and I was out on the street one day, just to give you an example, and ran into somebody who was a powered wheelchair user, and there had been a large snowstorm and there was a lot of ice on the street, and they had managed to get stuck on the street and their wheels were spinning and spinning and spinning. They did not have the tools or the strategies at that point to troubleshoot that situation, or those social skills, those strategic social skills that Dan talked about, to actually address the situation with the people around them. So the next one is things like disconnection of AAC systems. So if somebody is, for example, I had a client that I worked with who was a C4-5 quadriplegic, and he used a switch access system that was connected by Bluetooth to all of his communication systems. There were times when that periodically disconnected, where the Bluetooth didn't actually stay connected to his communication systems. And that can be a challenge when it is how you interact with the rest of the world. He was independent for most of his day. He was absolutely capable of being independent for most of his day, but couldn't adequately manage if that system shut down. I also like to think about things like adjustments to systems, if there are adjustments that need to be made on a regular basis, or especially with computing systems, when they go into that dreaded update cycle and people aren't necessarily prepared for it, or it maybe changes something fundamental in terms of how they access their device. So of course, there's also a range of required knowledge and competence that we think about here. So we always have to consider whether our clients have any cognitive impairments, whether they might have memory loss, which could impact their capacity to address some of these challenges and to implement some of those more strategic skills, and the fine and gross motor skills that they have or that they may need in order to actually troubleshoot those problems. Dan, you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So when we're thinking about building capacity in this case, we're really wanting to start with an understanding of the client's capacity across all stages, every part of their life. So in a typical day, what is their capacity? But also under pressure, when something's gone wrong, does their capacity change? Does that impact how they experience their life? And then for those clients of ours who may have fluctuating conditions, on their best day, they might be able to troubleshoot something in a particular way, but on a challenging day, they may not be able to do so as well. So I think we really have to be mindful of our client's capacity and have those conversations with the client about what those days look like. When we're thinking about providing instruction, I think first we're really talking about instructing the client. So that's providing oral instructions, talking them through it. It's having them practice things, but it's also providing that backup written instruction that they may need in the event something goes wrong or in the event that they can't quite remember what happened. And I think what's really important here is both how to help themselves, so how to troubleshoot these problems on their own, but also how to instruct their assistants. So for the person that I mentioned who I encountered who was out on the street and had gotten stuck in the ice and wasn't able to get out of it with their wheels spinning, they had obviously either not received or had forgotten the instruction that they had received in how to instruct others to help them get out of a situation like that. Had they been provided with that instruction where they knew how to instruct someone else to take the wheel locks off the chair and to actually put the chair essentially into neutral so that they could have been pushed off the ice, they could have instructed any passerby to have provided them with that assistance. There were lots of people trying to help. Of course, the motors were still engaged. They couldn't push them off the ice. And it wasn't until someone with knowledge, which was me, came along and said, I can help you out of this situation. That instruction could have been provided to that client ahead of time, and they could have then practiced how to provide that instruction to others. So how to provide instruction to others, I think that is one of those critical social skills that's necessary and that we really need to be thinking about when it comes to independent living. We also want to provide instruction to any identified supporters. So if they have family members who are going to come over regularly or be that first port of call, whoever they're going to call first, we want to make sure that they have and understand the necessary instructions or that they have access to them. It's also really important that we consider things like ongoing maintenance, making sure that that chair or whatever the device is being maintained on a regular basis to reduce the likelihood of there being challenges that come up. Practice, practice, practice. I think it's really essential that we not only teach people, but that we encourage practice for the skills that they're going to need. I think backup systems are really important as well. When something goes wrong and somebody doesn't have access to the troubleshooting they need, that they're able to access some kind of backup system. So if you think about that person who was who was a switch access user and used Bluetooth, if that system went down, they needed a backup emergency system to call for assistance to help them get reconnected. So making sure those backup redundant systems are in place. I think really important that we establish clear lines of communication for contact for the individual in case of an emergency, and that we identify what those emergencies may look like ahead of time so we know that they're contacting the right people. And then finally, that we are able to provide something written in terms of a troubleshooting guide that gives them the most common challenges that they might encounter. Next slide, Dan. Thanks. So in terms of independent living resources, and I think you're going to see that we all repeat some of these things over and over again. Product manuals are always great for a client to have access to, provided that they have the skills necessary to understand them. But it may be someone else in their life as well, if they don't have those skills, that would be able to provide that support. Very clear instructions written at the client's level, which provide instruction for use, but also for troubleshooting. Links to things like YouTube videos or other support guides. There are tons of YouTube videos for things like wheelchair maintenance or other AT related troubleshooting that can be incredibly useful. And it sometimes is helpful to identify some of those ahead of time. Making sure there's a really clear path towards emergency phone numbers and contact information, or how they're going to get involved or engage with someone in the case of an emergency. And I just called out here that there's a series of wheelchair maintenance videos and guides online. And so there's tons of resources when it comes to maintenance. And I think it's really important that we provide those to our clients early on in the process. And then just to remember that all information that we provide to our clients needs to be in an accessible location, so accessible to them, but also to any caregivers, and it must be clearly marked. So it may even be that there is a sign which says where it is if it's not readily available, in a place like on their fridge or somewhere where the person's going to go to look immediately if there's any challenges. Great.
All right. Now, well, the interesting thing about this workshop is we organized our material sort of separately, and we wanted to pause in between here and take time to reflect and comment on each other's, again, transdisciplinarily from different perspectives. So Emma, the one that's striking me that I want to pick up on is where you were talking about the capacity to troubleshoot under pressure. What do you do to, I guess, simulate that or talk that through with a client?
I think, our clients know themselves really well, typically, especially our independent living clients, right? The reason they're independent living is because they have the capacity to be, and they typically know what they're like under pressure. So if you say to them, what happens when something goes wrong and you panic, how do you react? They're typically pretty able to give us that conversation. So to have a really meaningful conversation with our clients about that, make sure they're at the center of that decision making, and ask what supports they would need to be able to make the best decisions in those moments. I think it has to largely come from the client, but I also think practice here. Like, every person does better under pressure if they have practiced ahead of time. So if it's something that you expect to go wrong, getting stuck somewhere for somebody who accesses outdoor environments a lot, that's something I expect to go wrong, right? I'd rather practice that ahead of time, practice it a bunch of times so that when they are under pressure, it's something that's second nature.
It's a really good point. And, as I'm looking at, Emma's context and comparing it to the context we're going to discuss next, you're completely right. The resources are very similar across the context, but it was very clear that with an individual living independently in the community, you're empowering the client, right? That's the really big point here. We're empowering the client. And as we look at the next context, it's as much about empowering the client, but empowering the care team that's around that client in this interdisciplinary living. So it'll be a nice sort of transition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think what comes to mind for me with kids is that it would be a little more difficult for them to envision what it's like to be under pressure. So you're saying in this context, you can say to an adult living independently, how are you when you're under pressure? What does that mean to you? Whereas with a younger person, they may not have experienced a lot of life yet or not know that. I'm not saying they wouldn't necessarily, they might, but sometimes you might have to simulate or come up with a little more scenario-based kind of situations. Hey, what would happen if, and then give the sort of scenario of what the pressure would be like.
Or you may have to have that conversation with a caregiver who says, this is how they normally react when they're scared or when the world is too much, right? So it may be that we look to other people as well.
And for me in the schools, it was for the social competency, envisioning that for the kid. Okay, you're going to go out and use this in your classroom. You're going to use this at recess. Let's picture what it's like with other kids around you to sort of sort that piece out.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Makes sense.
Great.
All right, Brenda.
Okay, so I will pick it up from here and discuss interdependent living. I'm going to focus on adults living in a community integrated living arrangement. So these are the individuals who previously resided in a long-term care facility, and they've moved to the community in a residence with smaller groups of individuals. So this could be 4 individuals, 6, 12, 16, it kind of depends on the facility. And with this new living arrangement, many of the individuals also have the opportunity to go off-site to a day training program. So we're looking at sort of 2 different settings in this context. One of the biggest things I think we think about and that we encounter primarily in this setting is caregiver turnover. In long-term care facilities, it seems pretty common to have frequent staff changes. It's the same case at group homes and in these day programs as well. The other thing that's really critical in this environment is the change that occurs as the shift changes. So what happens when we are there during the day delivering equipment, instructing the client, instructing the staff that's there during the day? What happens with that information when that shift changes? Does that information get communicated to the next shift and to the next shift? So those are things that we need to be aware of in addressing as well. Residential setting changes, as I was just describing, going from a long-term care facility into a group home setting can be very different as well. And so in a long-term care facility, I think the environment is pretty predictable. The individual is primarily traversing indoor surfaces, maybe linoleum predominantly, maybe a low pile carpet, and then they move outside and they've got some concrete, maybe pathways, sidewalks, maybe a concrete patio, but it's very predictable. When they move to a community residence, it's less predictable outdoors. The indoors might be very similar, although a smaller distance for them to travel indoors. But the outdoors is what changes drastically, right? So they may have longer distances to travel or have the opportunity to travel, which is awesome. They might encounter grass and gravel and all those opportunities to get stuck in places that Emma was just talking about. So that's a new change for them as well. What you're watching in this video is a young man moving about in his residential setting, in a group home setting. You'll notice he's driving his wheelchair with his left arm, and he knows exactly where his supports need to be in that environment for him to get from A to B, because he's using just the one arm. So it's really very interesting. He knows the environment really well. He knows what his needs are. So that's very, very helpful, especially for us as evaluators to then help him select the most appropriate equipment as he moves forward. Communication barriers are huge, and this can take on a couple of different forms. So language is one of them. It can be, maybe we're not speaking the same language as the client or the caregiver, and we need to be aware of that ahead of time and make those issues, address those issues before we actually see the client. Maybe it's understanding AT terminology. I mean, we all know there's a lot of terms that we use in AT that are kind of unique to AT or might be unique to AT, and we always speak in acronyms. So it's really, really important to really address that language issue. And it's not just language that's spoken, right? So the other piece of that is, what if your individual that you're working with, your client, your caregiver, is using an alternate means of communication? And so we need to be aware of that. Maybe that's a situation where they're using a communication board or a dedicated device, or maybe they're using gestures and vocalizations that only a family member or a caregiver is able to understand. So those are really critical pieces for us to be aware of as well. The supplier issues also come into play here. So these things can take on the form of an insurance change. So an individual has worked with a supplier for years, and then their insurance plan changes and that supplier is no longer part of their network, and that's not an option for them to work with them any longer, unless they want to pay a huge amount of money out of pocket, which we also know is less likely. It can also be a communication issue where the individual doesn't have, it could be as basic as the individual not having the supplier's name and phone number at the ready, similar to what Emma was just discussing, having that information blatantly obvious to the person or to the caregivers. Or it can mean that the individual or the care staff is trying to contact that supplier and gets stuck in automated voicemails and is struggling trying to reach a person to speak with, that maybe that person could then guide them really quickly and answer their questions. So we want to keep all of that in mind. So you can go to the next slide, Dan. So in building capacity in this context, it's really, really important to involve as many people as we can from the beginning, right, in all the phases of service delivery. So that means involving the client and family members and care team staff, that they're going to be part of this process from the very beginning. And we realize that if we get these individuals all involved at the beginning and they're part of the decision making and part of the equipment selection, that we have a much higher chance of success of that equipment in that environment with that individual long term. So it's really important that we identify those key individuals, that we work together collaboratively with them, and we can train each aspect of the equipment operation to the right person or with the right person and talk on maintenance. It's really important that we document who's doing what, when, where, and why, so that everyone knows what their role and their responsibility is. I think that's really important as well. The photos that you see on the right of this slide is just an example of how important it is to involve everyone in the success of the equipment. So what you see on the top left photo, you see a young woman seated in her original manual wheelchair system. To its right, you see her seated in her new manual wheelchair system. And then the two photos below it are additional photos of her posture in this new manual wheelchair system. And you'll notice that she is seated in a very different position in that new system. So everyone involved knew that this transition to the new wheelchair and the new seating was going to be just that. It was going to be a transition, right? And everyone knew that once it was fit and delivered, we had to have a plan in place. And so there was a plan in place. It was important that the client was the one who drove this process. She really decided how she wanted to sit, how it worked for her functionally, how it worked for her comfortably. And her day program manager was right there from the very, very beginning, and she was on site every day to address any issues that arose. We had conversations with her family members because she would go there on weekends and communicated with them as to what the home needs might be and the changes that might occur. The day program manager communicated with the residential staff. So there was a lot of communication going on, and that's what really attributed to this transition process being well orchestrated into the success of her equipment. Next slide, Dan. So finally, looking at the resources, and again, overlapping with a lot of things that Emma was just talking about in her section, at the fitting and delivery, we always go through an oral instruction along with a visual demonstration of how the equipment works and how to maintain it. And yesterday I was sitting in a session and the presenter talked about videotaping that instruction, which I thought was a great idea, to give that client and that caregiver or family another means of like, oh, I don't remember what they said. What did she say? How did she do this? It's a great way of visually showing the folks later how to find those solutions. We always give those product manuals from the manufacturer. We'll point out specific things that might be unique to what they're receiving, whether that's laundering the seat covers or back support covers, whether that's how to maintain things or charge a wheelchair battery, things of that nature. When it comes to troubleshooting, we're going to do that same thing. We're going to go ahead and we're going to do everything orally. This is what you should do. This is who you should call. We're going to provide that in written format, and that's going to be a document that they receive that lists all the equipment they got that day, who's responsible for it, who it came from, the manufacturer, the supplier, the contact phone numbers. We're going to make a list of all the adjustments we made that day in case they have a problem the next day or down the road. Many times we will take that information and we will put it on a card and we'll laminate it. And so then that can either be visible on the wheelchair or in the person's backpack, for example. So it's at the ready with that person at all times. So what I just want to look at here is close with a quick video, and Dan's going to go ahead and play that. This woman is a program manager for a residential program, and she speaks to the importance of training and how wonderful it is to be empowered. Go ahead, Dan.
And just to train us is such a big thing because they're able to train the clients themselves on how to use things, but then they also train the staff here and the staff at the workshop, because a lot of the things that go wrong happen at the workshop. Telling us how to troubleshoot things, which in the end brings down the cost for repairs, because little things that we can do ourselves, they can either talk us through or show us sometimes so that the next time it does happen, we can just fix it. Because a lot of time the repairs that need to be done are small things, because if we can't fix it, we know that it could be a couple months.
And that's one of the things that I think really spoke volumes to us when we were talking with her, was that, hey, if you show us how to do even some simple things, we can keep this wheelchair up and running, keep this client up and running without having to involve other people and without having to incur time and cost. And that was huge. That was really huge. So.
Cool. Now for a little pause to chit chat between us about what Brenda just said in comparison to what Emma said.
Yeah, I think, Brenda, one thing that I was thinking about a lot was the, as you were talking, just the staff challenge, right? The turnover, whether it's shift to shift or whether it's because a staff member leaves. And even if you do identify that key individual who you're going to provide that training to, what if they leave, right? And so it's interesting thinking about all the different ways that we can document. And you talked about the video as an option, but maybe videos are actually a more important tool than we think about regularly. Like maybe we should always be doing a video of how somebody is supposed to be set up in their wheelchair that can be used as a training tool for the next person that comes in. I mean, I feel like there could be a huge amount of potential in little training videos for any device that somebody's using.
Right. No, that's, and, you know, and that just speaks to the times, right? Like we have the technology available to us, we might as well use it. I was sifting through an old client packet and I came across Polaroid photos. So yeah, when I started, we used Polaroid photos. So I've been around a while, but yeah, I really think it's really important. I think the more people we can get involved, and like you said, it can't just be that one staff member, it needs to be one or two or three. And that's why for these folks, it's really important, as this woman said, to involve the residential staff and the day program staff, because then the more ears that hear us, the more likely things will get addressed.
I'm so glad you actually mentioned videoing training, because I, independently from you, I'm going to talk about that as well. And I thought everyone's going to think I'm totally crazy on this, but you're right. We have this in our pockets. How do we leverage it?
Yeah.
And what's similar about your context here is the number of staff. And I think it's probably maybe not as many in the given moment, because you've got shift changes and that going on that are different, but in total, it would add up to quite a few different people, which is a very similar challenge to the lives of young people who have a lot of caretakers, if you want to call them that, around them.
Yeah. Well, at the day program alone, right? You're encountering lots of different staff members in the day program setting than maybe they do in the residential setting. So yeah, exactly.
And I'm just seeing a message in the chat on videos from Marianne saying, I've done training videos, make sure you use the client's phone or device, as the staff or the caregivers might leave and the instructions might go with the person. And I think that's just a really good point.
Really good point.
It might even just be a case of, it might be that you use your own device, but you make sure that it's stored on a client's device to make sure that they always will have access to it and can share it. And it goes back to those social skills, right? You have to know the videos on your device to be able to share it, or somebody has to pass that information on. So we have to make sure that that part of the puzzle is addressed too.
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah.
All right. Any other thoughts on this? Thanks, Marianne, for chiming in. So let's finally here talk about the context of children at school at home. On the slide, I'm showing a smiling white boy in a wheelchair with a physical therapist kneeling in front of him, holding his hips. I'm going to call this developmental living, even though, like I said before, development continues into adulthood. And I'm going to speak mostly from my experience working in schools. I'm a special educator and was a district-wide AT coordinator. And the implementation of complex technologies for children involves a huge amount of collaboration between home and school and clinic. But a lot of the work of implementation happens where the kids spend a good chunk of their day, which is at school. And I was just recently reading, and forgot to bring this title up, but a qualitative research article of kids with CP in Taiwan, and it reinforced this perspective. They're using their AT more at school than they are at home. Again, it wasn't a large sample, it was a qualitative study, but that's my perception also in the school district. The strength of the developmental living, if we can call it this, school and home, is also one of the biggest challenges, right? There's so many caregivers involved, If you start adding up all the people, it's actually a crowd who often crowd into a room together sometimes. In addition to the parents and the support staff who may work with the family at home, and sometimes they have quite a few. At school, there's the teachers, there's the therapists, like the occupational therapist, the physical therapist, the speech language pathologist, the vision itinerant, and the paraprofessionals or teaching assistants who are very closely involved in many of the caretaking tasks throughout the day. The picture I'm showing on this slide is one of my former students from years ago, and there's only one of the support staff's hand sort of in the picture, but there were lots of people involved in the life of this young girl who is now an adult. So of course, all these caretakers are naturally part of a child's environment, which is great because young children may not be ready to troubleshoot their own technology. Although there's another comment I was going to make on Emma's back to why don't we teach them a few more troubleshooting strategies? We could. So they're often relying on parents, guardians, and school personnel for support. And the presence of so many relationships, of course, is a major facilitator, but the challenge is all the people to train. And not everyone can attend the training at the same time. So that's where we're talking about this whole video idea. It is ideal, though, if you can get them in the same room at the same time. And as a school district-based coordinator, I was able to make that happen for kids with really complex AT, including seeing mobility and communication devices. At the beginning of the school year, we'd coordinate a whole day of training and try to get everybody there. But usually you can't do that during the school year. The other challenge of having so many people involved is that it's really easy to drop the ball. And I think Emma mentioned this too, and Brenda. So the roles and responsibilities of all these people have to be clarified. If you're coming into the school or home from the outside as a supplier or a technician or a clinician, you need to be aware of this and plan for it. Actually, even if the child's coming to you in the clinic, which happens with seating a lot, since the schools aren't always usually doing it, at least in the States, you have to imagine all those different caretakers in this person's life and think of ways to include them. And maybe more than just imagining them or being aware of them is planning to include them and build their capacity. So thinking through multiple perspectives here, I was on the inside when I worked for schools as an employee of the district, but we had 20 schools, a preschool, 13 elementaries, and 4 middle schools and 2 large high schools. So I had to think about this issue of capacity building because I wasn't a daily member of an individual's team. And as the AT coordinator, I got involved in coordinating support from people from the outside the school district too. Sometimes proactively, like the time I literally drove a student during the school day to the wheelchair supplier's shop 30 minutes away in the family's wheelchair accessible van, along with the physical therapist and the paraprofessional. Okay, that was very unusual. Yeah, it makes a good story, but it doesn't happen a lot. I would highly encourage the outside suppliers and clinicians to be the ones traveling to the school instead of the other way around. So obviously the key to capacity building in this setting is the collaboration. That's a theme here. Not everyone's going to have the same role, but you need to invite all the stakeholders to participate in the way that makes most sense for them in order for them to buy into it. It sounds obvious, but I can't tell you how many times early on I used to forget about including, so-and-so in our efforts to implement or troubleshoot AT. And I was focused on my own responsibilities, and that was it. But then, you learn from your mistakes. It's more work to plan collaboratively, but it'll save you time in the long run if you include everybody. And again, if you can schedule a group training, ideal, but recognizing we can't do that. A key strategy is on-demand training, and we've been talking about that a little bit. So yes, recorded trainings or recording your training, it extends the training beyond that one little window of time that you have in a scheduled appointment. And it's hard to think about in the moment, but we do have the resources in our pockets with smartphones to do that. So to address the challenge of having all these caretakers involved, a specific capacity building strategy that's often used in schools is a written implementation plan. And for schools, there's actually tons of templates online that are available, and everyone recommends them, but they're actually hard to put into practice because they can be negatively perceived as like one more thing to do. In my experience, it's actually not so much the written document itself that's important, the piece of paper that might just get put in a file and forgotten. It's actually the process of creating the document that's important. It's the actual act of figuring out who's responsible for what and what really counts. Little things, who's going to charge the switch interface batteries on the back of the wheelchair, that go a long ways, right? That are huge. Who's going to adjust the AAC mount after the kid goes on a bumpy ride in the playground during recess, and the whole eye gaze tracking device goes out of alignment. Two much more involved aspects of this whole thing. Finally, I want to say that AT implementation, training, and troubleshooting, especially in this setting, needs to take place in the context of a daily activity as much as possible, or be simulated to be as real as possible. This is probably true for all contexts, but here's where it's maybe a little different from what Emma was talking about with adults. As I commented earlier, the students may not be able to envision those environments as well. So it's important with kids to help them generalize to do the training within those contexts. So some wheelchair specific examples that come to mind from my experience are practice driving outside for recess and discovering that the route to recess is, really complicated. And even something simple as practicing parking at the desk in the classroom, navigating around those other chairs. I mean, even if we make the room more accessible and kind of clear a path to the kid's desk, inevitably in a classroom of 28, 30 kids, things are going to be in the way. So we did that while the other kids were out at recess, so that wouldn't be quite as crazy. Although speaking of learning this stuff under pressure, maybe we should have had them practice with the kids in the classroom too. For a homeschool connection, it might be important to simulate doing homework at home because the team needs to think through some access issues. So here I'm kind of going beyond the seating and thinking about seating and connecting it to other access means, but I've had several wheelchair using students whose seating and positioning at home was not their wheelchair. It was a living room recliner or a beanbag. And if the home's not accessible, of course, the wheelchair is sitting in the garage. That happened, quite a bit, it seemed like. And it left behind then all the lovely switch access that you've been working on for months that's attached to the chair. So how are they going to access something at home? That's it's sort of going beyond, thinking beyond, and that's the strategic use of AT in a sense. It's going to change by context. So let's look now at a couple resources to support capacity building at home school, some generic sort of ideas that are not prepackaged solutions. So obviously, we've said before already, links to vendor-made training materials is really important in this context, like other contexts. It's part of the on-demand training strategy that's needed to accommodate this crowd of caretakers. But how do you share them? How do people find them? In my experience, it's not really that easy to find the right training section in a manufacturer's website. I hope the manufacturers out there are listening. And sometimes you can find it, but you can't find the specific part that applies to a user. So what I'd suggest for the school setting in particular is a landing page for on-demand resources that leverages the fact that we have a smartphone in our pockets that we can use to pull up information. And this doesn't have to be complicated. A simple Google Doc might be sufficient for collecting links to vendor created training materials, YouTube videos or paper or PDFs and stuff. The ones that are particularly needed for each individual client. So many schools in the US are using Google Apps for team collaboration, and they are very familiar with using Google Docs as a collaboration tool. If the district doesn't use Google, Microsoft Office 365 has similar features now. Just make sure to set the sharing permissions so that everybody can access the document and add to the document and make it become a living resource. Now, if you want to get fancier, Google also makes it easy to create websites with Google Sites. And there are other free, easy sort of website creation tools too. And this option is nice because you can embed the how-to videos, like the recordings that you might have made. And you're probably thinking, Dan, you're crazy. I don't have time to create a website. But here's where I'm going to turn the idea of the operational and functional skills back on you. Anything new seems daunting at first and time consuming until you practice it enough. But it's actually only a little bit more difficult to create a website than it is to create a Word doc these days. It's really not that much harder with templates like Google Sites. And it's more flexible, it distributes more easily. And when you make updates in the background, the team gets the updates right away. I found this, I did it as a district-wide capacity building tool, and maybe didn't get to the point where we're doing it for individual kids, but so many of the assistants for kids were maybe younger people who were on their way to other careers. They were working in the schools for a while. They were very comfortable whipping their phone out for whatever. Why not use it to look up the resources that they need for troubleshooting in the moment? And the same with the user, of course. So finally, I will share just a little resource here, and I forgot to copy it so I could put it in the chat for you. But if you work with schools a lot, the IRIS Center at Vanderbilt University has updated an AT training module, and there's a page on implementation to which I've contributed. It includes the implementation plan template I showed you on a screenshot earlier. If you aren't used to working in schools and you're found yourself working with children, it might be good to view that just to get a sense of how things are done from the school perspective. All right, so that's what I had for you for that context. Let's now have another little transdisciplinary discussion about it, and then we'll have a little time for Q&A. And this is your point to be thinking, gosh, what do I want to add to this conversation about context? Because we know we're not covering all the possible permutations there are out there for this and all the strategies, just giving you some sample ideas of how strategies do or don't fit into particular contexts.
I think you raise a really good point, Dan, just regarding the theme that's come across, right, is that we are identifying key individuals, starting with the individual at the center of our whole process, right, the client, the student, and then casting our net as wide as we can to provide information and empower the folks around that person to support that person, right? I mean, we're creating a support network is essentially what we're really hoping to do in any context. I don't think it matters. It's just who those support people are changes, right, a little bit in each context. So I think that's really important, is that the message really is the same across contexts, is that we are empowering support for the individual and empowering the person. So whatever age they are.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just an interesting point, Brenda, just the idea that it's about empowering the person at whatever level we're able to empower them, and filling in the gaps, in a sense, with the other supporters around them. It's right. Not that a child can't learn some of the skills they need to learn, and maybe it's a progressive learn over time, right? Like maybe it's troubleshooting skills for a particular piece of it today, but because they're 5, but when they're 7, when they're 8, that's going to change, and they're going to be able to take on more of that learning themselves. But that's also about setting them up well for independent living as an adult, right? If that's the route that they're going to be going, if those skills can be set early, and when we can incorporate those skills into the training when the child is growing, then it's going to serve them well regardless of what environment they end up in down the road as well. Yeah, no, I think you're completely right. It's recognizing who you're working with and dosing the information or providing the information appropriately, right? I mean, I think we do that in general and everything we do with everybody we communicate with. So, our clients, no matter what the age, are exactly the same. So very true.
Yeah, because that's a good point. I was thinking about, sort of actively thinking here about a first grade student who was using a very fancy new wheelchair, plus AAC device, plus other things. And there's only so much that he can be expected to take in as a first grader, while at the same time being in this context in which he's learning all this stuff first graders are learning. And he was a very curious little kid, et cetera, very eager to learn this stuff. So it's metering it out in a sense, along with, and this is the whole thing about implementation in the context, right? It's in the context. It's in the fact that there's real life happening around the person. Real life first grade in this case. I keep picturing the very cluttered and crowded classroom, all the different people involved, as we're sort of focusing on one aspect of it at a time.
Sure. Dan, you have a comment in the chat to please list that your URL in the.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I will grab that URL, because actually we're at the point where we're just going to wrap this up and give you a few minutes to chime in if you want to or ask questions. just to re-emphasize that we're talking about AT implementation as capacity building and as ways that we can go beyond, I think, direct support. In my head, this is connecting to a position paperwork we're working on in RESNA for K-12 settings, in which we're really advocating capacity building because there's never going to be enough of us meaning dedicated AT people, to do all the direct service and support that needs to be done. And I think that's probably true across all the contexts. So it really is, AT implementation really is a capacity building project. Just also wanted to ask people to save the day for the RESNA conference. If you like this sort of transdisciplinary chat, this is more of it can be continued throughout the rest of the way. So I'm going to get that link right now off of my slide and open up the chat for any questions or comments or your perspective on this as well.
Just seeing Mary's comment there, saying, do you think there's or how can organizations support this effort? Do you think there's a place for a badge or for maybe both providers and consumers or other ideas to build recognition or awareness? I think it's so dependent on setting, right? Like in schools, maybe a badge would be a great idea. And maybe it's about training peers as well, right? A peer can help troubleshoot and they get a badge for it. Like, yeah, I can totally see the potential for that. And similarly in other more residential settings, I think in independent living, it might be more difficult, right? It might not be as ideal a scenario for that kind of approach, but certainly think that there's room for that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a very neat idea to empower everyone around you, literally get everybody involved. I mean, really, I think, especially in the schools with the younger kids, I think getting peers to support each other, I think is huge. You know, I really do. I mean, we've seen it with a lot of the younger kids that we've worked with over the years, and it's really important. It's wonderful to see a very supportive family, but when you see a supportive environment, it's huge, really huge. I remember the day we delivered a powered wheelchair to a little boy who was 5, and we, you know, came down the street in our big truck, so we weren't easy to disguise ourselves. But I can't even count the number of neighborhood kids. It was as if we were like the fire truck from the parade, because they could not wait for this little boy to get his chair, and they were all in because he could play with them finally. So they got involved. They all deserve badges that day for sure.
Thank you for bringing up the peer support. I'm ashamed I didn't put that in the part I was talking about, but absolutely, it's a huge piece.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it goes a long way to addressing things like stigma too, right? The more that peers are engaged, the more normalized things become.
Absolutely. It's a challenge though. I mean, it's not a magic bullet. I think I've been involved in kids with very complex AT, including seating mobility, in a completely included setting, and it gets really tricky. You don't think of it as something that's going to happen all at once. It's a work in progress, which is the capacity building piece of this, I think.
There's a note here from Chris saying, I'm a huge fan of proactive versus reactive. Clients can be empowered by giving them front-end knowledge, so when issues or challenges arrive, they have enough information and confidence to execute. Education is my primary focus with all clients, delivery and follow-up. And I think that's you're really sort of preaching exactly what we've been saying, Chris, the sense of like, we can provide this education, we can prepare people ahead of time. Not only can we, it's our responsibility to, if we think about the range of services that we provide, that we really do have a responsibility to make sure that our clients get the best of what we have to offer. And that includes all that training.
I love that you're saying we have the responsibility to do this, because I think that's where we need to shift in our field, is beyond the direct service piece, which obviously is what you're getting paid to do. It's almost like reconceiving what your role is, what your responsibility is to this proactive approach, in a sense. Anybody else? All right, looks like we're at time. So Mary Ann is saying the time we have is so limiting. Yes, yes. Education adjustments, possibly training. We need to think about extending sessions if at all possible, right? That's the problem too with our institutional context here for all of this, is not being given enough time to do all the training we need to do. Vince is asking for the code for the survey. Is this something I'm supposed to have?
No, the moderator should have it.
Oh, okay. All right, does the moderator have a code for the survey? Yes, David Beals, a huge elephant in the room is funding and the time to do this. I think part of, I don't think there's an easy answer to that, right? But I think it's when we reconceptualize implementation as more than a direct service, maybe that's part of what can be used to justify the need for the time and thinking of it beyond the individual client. I don't know, this is a huge question. All right, thanks everybody. I'm not sure if.
I don't think that we've had the code yet, right? Oh, there it is.
Oh.
Okay, perfect.
So Larissa's just put the code
Thanks,
into the
Larissa.
chat.
B576J2.
Yes, just to repeat, the CEU code for this session is B576J2.
Thank you everybody for attending. It was really fun to be with you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.